Mm. William, can you hear me? Let's see, maybe it's on my side.
So to the extent that we want to play long games with wonderful people, one has to figure out where do you find long games and how do you find wonderful people, and how are you successful in those endeavors? So, I mean, a couple of things that were interesting to me as I got roped into the project. One was a recent interview done with Todd Combs, who mentioned that one of the first conversations he had with Charlie Munger. Munger asked him, what percentage of S&P 500 businesses do you think will be better businesses in the next 5 years? And Coombs said probably less than 5%, and Munger said less than 2%. And so to the extent that we're all either building businesses or investing in businesses or both, and to the extent that that's true, that's a very, very small number. It's far from a 50-50 coin toss. That's a 1 in 100 or less chance of a business in the S&P 500 today being wonderful in 5 years. And so if that's really true, and I think if you look at history, you find this, right? Most businesses don't survive the test of time over a long enough time horizon. Almost all go bust. And then if you want to build things that last and you want to serve people in a way that will, build lasting relationships, you got to take seriously the idea of what comprises those 5% or 2% that actually get better with time. And I would marry that with one other idea. So some of us went on this kick around some of the research on the concept of ergodicity over the last few months. And maybe if I just summarize that really briefly. So the world often talks in terms of expected value, and certainly from an investment perspective, or even just kind of how we comport our lives, we say sort of if the probability of a venture or an activity is expected to be positive, then we ought to do it. And if you dig a little bit more on the math behind that, what you can realize is something like a coin toss game. This is a way ergodicity is commonly explained. So a coin toss game where heads, your bet grows by 30%, and tails, it shrinks by 25%. So you would say, all right, well, it's a 50-50 coin, it's a fair coin. And if I win, I make a little bit more than I lose. That's a positive expected value game. And actually it is, except that if you play that game over and over and over and over and over and over, what you realize is that the median or the most common outcome of that game is going broke. And that's because played over and over and over and over and over, if you lose 25%, 25%, 25% enough times, you basically end up with no money to keep betting. So even though there will be some players in the game who win 30%, 30%, 30%, and make many, 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 many fold their bet, the median, or some might say that the most common outcome of that game is actually bankruptcy. And that's actually a really disturbing concept to get the brain around, because you tie this back to quality. You realize that not only is it very rare and difficult to be in the realms of high quality, if you go bust, whether or not you're pursuing quality, you don't get to play the game again. And so from an investment perspective, or from the perspective of building a business or building a relationship, really anything we do in life, you realize that the way we think about failure is probably not quite right. It's not just a case of let's take positive expected value bets. It's actually let's comport ourselves in a way where we always survive. And then within that context of making sure we always survive, then let's pursue quality in all its forms.
Yeah, really well said.
What I would also add to that concept is we're finding that this pattern keeps coming up. So the road to what is perceived as quality at an investor level often is a business that has removed imperfections at a rate greater than the next business. And they actually are quite playful in how they do that. But by the time they're in business for 10, 15 years and they've removed a ton of imperfections, you end up with something that's very attractive and obviously has durability that the next business may not have. And that can go everything from kind of the Amazon Kaizen kind of approach of being as efficient as possible with resources on through a P&L perspective, but also it comes down to, at a cultural level, an owner's mindset that is used often in investors circles tends to always be referring to, can you be aligned to my interests and frugality? Or, well, if we pull that apart, it actually means, will you remove imperfections in the same way as an owner of the business would, or will you spot the areas of wastage in many ways through the system? And so it's ergodicity is a mathematical concept, but we kept finding this pattern. Like even there's master craftsmen in Japan in a business called Kakaido, and when they talk about learning mastery of their trade, they learn it through their grandparents effectively only influencing them and only sharing what was imperfect about their processes and their products over time. They don't confirm what was perfect. And so it's this really unusual corollary that the road to what we perceive as durability might be avoiding death, but multiplied over time, or likewise in a culture, how do you build a good quality culture? It's making sure that you don't get worse every single day that might lead to a successful outcome. And so not to go down a huge a rabbit hole on it, but it's just something of a pattern that we're seeing across these businesses over time. That's quite an interesting thread that folks may enjoy going down.
All right, so this framing has been super helpful, and we've danced around this concept of quality now. So let's dive in. Where's a helpful place to begin, whether that's a surprising learning or what's top of mind today? I'll leave sort of the path to be trodden up to you guys, but where should we start to better understand this concept?
I would offer.
Will, why don't you go ahead?
It's difficult. What I'd offer is a primer on as a way to move towards an answer. There's a quote from Donella Meadows, a renowned systems thinker, that I think is quite useful. And she writes in this quote, "There are no separate systems. The world is a continuum. Where we draw the boundary around a system depends on the purpose of the discussion." And so by that would invite us into, there are different perspectives one can take on quality. And so where we draw those boundaries, it's really worth, and I think we as a group spent quite a lot of time thinking about the implications of drawing the boundaries on the answer. That the broadest possible definition and way one might be able to talk about quality would be from the perspective of the system of nature. You could then move into culturally conditioned ways of thinking about business and what quality might look like in that context, what the dominant modes of thinking and acting might invite, all the way down to on an individual level. So I'd say if we're looking for deep quality on a systemic level, the multi-party stakeholder win-win seems pretty essential. And even more broadly, there seems to be a general process. There seems to be a general evolutionary process that we're participating in of increasing complexification in nature. You go from your single cell amoebas all the way through to Mozart, and here we are. And so there seems to be this pattern of increased complexification. There seems to be, in a biological context, an increase in the I'd say an increase in the scope of non-zero sum games being played, and finally, and this is there's a beautiful essay from Brett Anderson that goes into a good deal of detail on this. But when we really look at things from the broadest possible perspective, he actually links the latest scientific, or talks about the latest scientific literature in this context, and talks about the large brain size in human beings being socially and sexually selected for based on our ability and propensity to participate in the process of discovering and facilitating non-zero sum games. So I guess that would be the biological evolutionary context as a lens on quality, increasing complexity, increasing disposition towards non-zero sum games, and
Will, just to jump in really quickly, just to make sure I'm making the logical leap with you guys, it seems like you're conflating there, like non-zero sum, cooperation, win-win with quality. Is that correct? Is it a subset of quality? What's sort of the link between those concepts?
I would say that on a there seems to be, and maybe the rest of the group can comment, but there seems to me to be some sort of process on an evolutionary basis that invites increasing participation in non-zero sum games, and that's I would equate that with quality on a systemic level.
I mean, one way to look at this is to say, so because of the point on ergodicity we mentioned, or just the fact that we believe, most organizations will be worse 5 years from now. One way to look at quality is to kind of flip the question and say what didn't survive, or look at what does survive. And I think that ties back into Will's point on, if you look at, say, evolution of organisms, to some extent, organisms that figure out how to survive and grow tribes and kind of move beyond single player mode to multiplayer mode to coordinated multiplayer mode, et cetera, have greater chances of survival than those that kind of don't figure out how to move beyond, say, themselves as single cell operators. With that comes increasing complexity. And so I think you see this certainly in just natural evolution, but also in organization evolution, in interpersonal evolution, et cetera. Those that don't move beyond a base level of capability tend to lose out in the next round.
Yeah, there's a couple of things worth adding. Like, I think to try and unpack what are the big questions here, one of the big areas that we spend a lot of time is kind of what are the qualities that regardless of what area, whether it's in business models, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in management teams, whether it's in kind of overall investment portfolios, what are the terms that continuously bubble up? And some of the ones that kept coming up were trust, resilience, mastery, creativity, longevity, and I think Blas, absolutely, like win-win is inherent. Why? Because frankly, when you look at the oldest businesses, the oldest S&P 500 businesses, they're 300 plus years old, tend to be banks. There's Palmolive Gate as well, and then you also have financial services businesses beyond that, construction businesses. But if we flip their whole business and say what has endured, relationships has effectively been the bed that they have built their 300-year track record off. And I think when you come back to relationships, well, what leads to good relationships is no different to saying, well, what leads to a good family or a relationship with your partner or whatever. It is effectively the same dance. It's saying, well, we have to be aligned on certain things, and we have to have principles on certain things that we're both aligned on. And then when we're outside the boundaries, let's come back to it. And I think we find that pattern come up in the relationships of the businesses that have survived over multiple decades and multiple centuries enough in many different cases as well, that there's a coherence through the ecosystem from a customer relationship level to a team level to an owner level, and maybe even beyond to suppliers as well, which comes back to, Blas, you know better than anyone in terms of the 7-party win-win structure that you have. But I think that is I have to admit, I kind of was biased against that answer, but it's just come up over and over and over that without a firm bed of a relationship that has those elements within them, you cannot be flexible in building durability into your system. And I think in a world where we're driven to 2-year outcomes, that takes effort and conscious active effort from all of us behaviorally to counteract some of the influences that we're under. And I think in the investment world in particular, that's a huge blind spot that we can go into more detail on in terms of how to spot those things. But I think it's just something that we've continuously been really surprised about, that the operators who have built these businesses for 10, 20, 50 years know this intuitively. The investor world tends to completely discount this factor.
And so 2 questions sparked from that, Paul. One is how you said intuitively there specifically, which is sort of hitting on this and sort of echoing McGilchrist a little bit. Like, is this something that has to be sort of like verbalized? Can these people, if you bring up the framework or if you talk about win-win, like, is that language they use? Is it just something that they, left brain, right brain understand? How would you think about that? And then the second piece I'd be curious to learn more about. I think early in these discussions, there was this, at least if I remember correctly, like this dance of like, is quality duration? Are those one and the same? How to think about the two? And how have you progressed on that? Are they the same, et cetera? So, 2 questions there.
Okay, so great questions. I think and again, I'm early in the journey, so what do I know? But I think the learning of this is, I think, akin to muscle memory in exercise. I think you can talk about muscle memory, you can talk about concepts in fitness, but without the walking and without the breaking down of your muscle and repairing of it, we're not actually learning it at an emotional level and embodying it. And so I do think there is, I personally, I should speak for myself, have found I needed to embody it to actually understand. So I could talk about it in abstract circumstances, but unless I put it into action within X amount of weeks, X amount of months, I didn't embody it, and I didn't actually understand the depth to it. And so this comes back to, again, the Kakaido is this this tea caddy business, but just consider him a very like 6th generation craftsman, and when he's learning how to perfect his process, there was no words given to learn the process. He effectively had to build, like the tea caddies are kind of small enough units, but he would do about 10 to 20 of them. And then every single day he would get 10 minutes a day where his grandfather would come in and just tell him what was imperfect. And the terminology he uses is interesting. He says, I then need to take the feeling of what the imperfection was, and I need to learn that. And they openly speak about it taking 7 to 10 years to actually get that emotional embedding of that feeling into your process. So not to get overly theoretical and abstract about this, but I do think that there's a huge element here where the best operators don't know the theory behind why. They don't know the theory around what the commercial outcome is going to be. But they've learned that limited churn through a customer base is the only thing that matters at a certain point. And of course, this is a really important feedback loop they pay attention to. But it's what we've noticed when you step back to the next map up, which is investors, that's not learned. It's not and it's not appreciated because they're not playing that game. They're actually playing a game that is at a portfolio level. That's what they need to worry about. And so it's a lot of this is actually stepping back and saying, at first principles, what game are you playing? Can we just talk about that and actually define that, so then we can assess, are we talking about the same thing here? And founders, through my whole career in kind of working with smaller businesses, this has always been a blind spot that founders just can't stand generally the investment industry. Why? Because they speak a different language and they don't actually learn from failure, or they don't learn through the failure of entrepreneurship, if that's easier to think
well,
about.
and it's a business is a spreadsheet. I think you alluded, like, that's where you started, right? It's not an amalgamation of people and products. It's not all these things. It's metrics and it's conversion and it's et cetera. I don't want to lose the duration thread, and John, I might ask you, because I just saw you sort of smile about it. But two quick things came to mind. Like, the way I've kind of thought about this is, like, I think there's a little bit of a risk of, like, what I'm calling, like, podcast wisdom versus experiential wisdom, right? Like, I listen to podcasts on 2x all day, and I hope I don't fall into this trap. Like, I do consume a lot, but I think I take the time to try to act on it and think about it and how does it apply to me. But there is this very real, like, I just listen to great founders or investors or whoever talk all day, and therefore, like, I am that. And, like, the experiential thing, again, I think, like, the sports analogy or music analogy is so much easier to understand, but, like, you can't watch Steph Curry shoot a ball and then go shoot a ball, right? Like, that's not how it works. And as much as there are differences, but, like, the knowledge, that knowledge transfer doesn't happen just by listening. Like, you have to act on it. You have to, put it into practice in some way. The other quick thing before I turn it over, John, I think it gets to an important point you were saying, Paul. My mentor had this idea of, like, 0 + 0 can equal 1. And he was referring to this as, like, a parent with a baby. And again, like, helpful thought exercise here, but, like, we definitely went through this, Danielle and I, but, like, you can read and talk to people, but when you have your first kid, like, you have no idea what the hell to do, right? It's like you're effectively a 0. And the baby, of course, doesn't know how to raise itself. It also is a 0. But if again, I think this brings together a lot of fun concepts, but, like, if you're all in, if you're listening to feedback, if you're sort of paying attention, you can teach each other how to raise this baby, even though neither of you know how to do it. And I think there's something profound and interesting about that as it relates to building a company or any sort of relationship, right? Like, if you're in tune, paying attention, touching the medium, all in, the way that I treat Will and the feedback I see, I don't have to always ask him, like, hey, did you like that or not? I can feel it, right? I can sense it. Same thing with kind of this concept of building a company, but infinitely harder, right? You're now dealing with complexity and all these different counterparties. But I think that's where, like, you don't have to be an orator and philosophical to build a great company, right? You can just be so finely attuned with the people, with the value, with what you're building, that you, over years, again, it's not an overnight thing, but over years, you get a sense for, like, this segment loves A, B, and C. And, like, nobody else is doing that. And, you could just double down, and it doesn't have to be this very verbal thing. Sorry, enough of me talking. John, duration and quality, are they the same thing? Nice softball answer for you here, or question for you here.
Yeah, the answer is often. There's so much good stuff in there, though. I mean, I would say, back to your point on podcast wisdom versus real world wisdom. I mean, a practical thing we've actually said to each other multiple times as we work on this project is, listen to fewer podcasts and go build more. Which is just you put it very well. But if you want to be a good basketball player, go shoot baskets. Don't listen to Steph Curry talk about it, or listen to him a bit, but then go put it in practice. And so there's absolutely been a lot of that. I mean, one of the kicks that Paul has had us on is what we've kind of framed as paradoxes to quality. And one of those is actually that we lack a sufficient language often to talk about it, which I think is why, Paul's story about, being able to point out what's wrong, but maybe not have words for what's right. I think there's sort of just a basic semantic point that we culturally probably don't have nearly as well developed a language for quality. I think some of this jumps into McGilchrist, but that's sort of a simple point that's worth, it may be one of the reasons this is less discussed is culturally we haven't developed a good language for it yet.
Yeah, John, let me double click on that for a second, because like I think it's so incredibly important, and that's where like the limits of your language is the limits of your world, right? The old Schopenhauer line. And like the thing that comes to mind for me a lot with this project, and where I'm so excited about it, again, I there are many examples of this, but the one that's most salient to me, I guess, is Nick Sleep's like scale economics shared, right? It's such a simple concept. But it's so dense. And it's one of those things where it's like, once you understand it and see it, it's hard to unsee. And I think, you guys have the opportunity to do something similar, right? To create kind of like a new framework, a new way of seeing and thinking about things. And maybe it is as simple as the win-win framework, right? Maybe that's what it all distills down to. And if companies don't hit that, it's not that it's a great company, but there's an opportunity to be better, and there is some risk embedded in it. But I think that's where, without getting too verbal and relying too much on that, just kind of like conscious description of it. Right now, I think it does feel so ephemeral, right? And it's hard to grasp, and there's no good hooks to hang anything off of. So you're just kind of spiraling around a little bit and left floating. So if you guys do create some hooks, you can at least build off that, even if it's not perfect. So yes, I think that's a super important point to try to hone in on a little bit.
When we've learned, I'd say we've come some way in knowing what directions to head in, if that makes sense. So early on, I think we fairly quickly concluded, Excel junkies generally are going to miss quality. I've long kind of had this joke with investors that anybody who sits behind their screen all day just isn't going to get it. It's one of the first questions I usually ask investors if they're pitching something is, have you tried the products? Or have you bought the service? Or have you whatever? And it's just amazing to me how few people do. When I talk to software CEOs, the first question I ask them is, do you use your software? And that's another one which it's phenomenal how few do. But it's sort of obvious from this work and others that if you're not eating your own cooking, you're never going to make much progress. And how on earth are you going to endure for 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 years if you don't have that feedback loop? So in terms of what's not going to get you there, Excel is not going to get you there. Big brains aren't going to get you there either, which is kind of interesting. I won't go off on a tangent there, but you can't just sort of think your way to this. I think Paul put it well. You kind of have to live it. And so by contrast, if you study, for example, what are properties of systems that do survive? Well, generally, those systems are systems that exhibit positive forms of evolution. So you think about that in biological terms or in artificial system terms, but systems that are evolving in a way that benefits them. Generally, systems that survive have some forms of built-in redundancy. So the first sign of resistance doesn't break them. Often they are either exhibit forms of robustness, or ideally the best systems tend to actually in some ways benefit when disorder arises. You think about the company that has the balance sheet, so when the market craters, they actually can go buy their competitors, those sorts of things. So if you take what we've learned from studying systems and then apply it in life, so how do we then find quality? Well, we know that it's something that has evolved, right? So as Paul kind of said, it's not something that you just decide I'm going to build the best product on day one and boom, that's it. The root is actually got to build product A, then B, then C, then D, then E, then F, and G, on and on and on for years and years and years and years before you get to quality. It's not something that just magically arises. We know that a line we've been kicking around is mercenaries don't survive the base rate. And what we mean by that is those that sort of build a product or service and then just decide to exploit the thing entirely from day one eventually fail, right? We couldn't find any businesses that just were out to kind of rip everybody off, and actually they were around for hundreds of years. And this hooks back into, I think, why a lot of the investing world will struggle over the long run. Is if you're trying to figure out what survives a long time, you realize that there are things in the system that aren't efficient in the sense that investors might mean efficient, right? So there are, for example, Japanese companies famously tend to have way too much cash relative to what Western investors would like. And I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but there are more Japanese businesses that have survived for hundreds of years than anywhere else in the world. And I doubt that's accidental. I think those two things are linked. And if we go back to systems theory, we know that businesses need slack in the system to survive unexpected problems. And so having a little more cash than you ought to, this kind of gets back to grandma's wisdom, right? Having a little bit of cash under the mattress or whatever is generally just, useful because you don't know when you'll need it. So, back to your original question of is quality longevity? I think very often, yes. And so one route we've taken is kind of trying to work backwards from, okay, what has survived now? Why? Why is it not dead? And we found things like I've mentioned.
One, it's a reframing of this like long-term time horizon, but it made me think of Sam Hinkie has this line that he's only building relationships with people who are willing to go slow, where if somebody approaches him and just say, hey, like invest in my thing and, let's grab coffee and let's do this week, he like puts them on a blacklist forever. I don't know if that's true, but it's at least not what he prefers, where it's like, let's build this relationship or thing over the next 20 years. And like, it's saying the same thing, I think just kind of attacking it at a different angle. And it seems to me that people who have this mindset are okay with that. And this tension isn't move slowly and don't learn quickly and don't move fast, but it's I guess it's another Sam Altman line, but it's like impatience with actions and patience with results, right? How quickly can you have that feedback loop and keep the 10-year vision in mind to keep moving on it? Will, let's turn the focus to you for just a second, but anything to add on this thread, or if you want to change the path that we're going on, feel free to do so as well.
I think there's a few things that have come up that are really quite beautiful. And I think part of the subtext of the conversation is how does one experience that resonance or come into a relationship with quality on an individual level? That our conversation has progressed from, I think, an intensity of engagement in the map making world, this more abstract, conceptual way of engaging with the subject, and I think now we find ourselves talking about awareness practices, ways of being, ways of seeing that bring us into relationship with the world. So out of that connection, I think more interesting maps might arise. So we'll have frameworks, and those frameworks might be, some are truer than others. A good framework in a specific context might be true enough. But really, unless the map making is connected to the territory through some form of embodied cognition, awareness in McGilchrist's context and the brain science, the right hemisphere of our brain, and its approach to seeing the world, where it is comfortable with the implicit, where it is comfortable with the nonverbal, where it intuitively sees holes, sees the whole. That it's that connection to the territory, then through action, and I think it's led to. Well, it's focused our minds on conversations around certain businesses, certain ways of doing things. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about companies, one of which would be Costco, and Jim Sinegal as a leader, and there's probably plenty more we could share about that. But really, no, if there's anything I draw out, it's the importance of a connection to the territory through some form of embodied cognition, an embracing of the power of intuition. And again, that's also, often a dirty word, certainly in our industry. You could, maybe another way to frame it would be, to be more concrete, would be expert pattern recognition. But really that's got to come out of these feedback loops that John has been talking about, and that both John and Paul have been talking about, that this ownership, skin in the game. It's really quite simple. I think it's in some ways frighteningly simple.
And certainly
Do you mind if
for,
oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
sorry, short one. There's certainly for, so we went on a kick of, how does one find quality specifically in goods and services? And we effectively found that to be entirely summed up by mastery is at the root of everything. So, one way to look at it is, if you want to find the best goods or services, just find the people who have best mastered whatever craft is that leads to those goods and services, and there you have it. And obviously that's different in different places, but it's, as I've thought about it, at least I've not always started there, right? I've not always started with who are the masters in this field, and then I'll only look at their products or services. And it's been I think a fruitful, useful lens. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, that point is huge, because it actually comes down to what game you're playing. If you're playing a 10-year game, then you care about mastery. If you're playing a 1-year game, you don't care about it. But over the 10 years, it's all that matters. Over 1 year, it actually doesn't matter at all. And so it's this paradox that we keep seeing, that actually those who are building businesses that endure are playing by a different set of rules, because they're actually trying to build patterns that endure in a different way. And I would relate it to compounding, like James Clear's book, where he talks about compounding and how none of us understand it. Well, some do, but most of us don't. But it's the same concept, where effectively all that happens is you turn up and you do certain things every single day, but people don't. Why? I'm sure there's tons of reasons, and we don't need to go into those, but effectively the masters, the thread that John is talking about, those turn up because they're playing the long-term game in their field, and they have the energetic firepower to do that, which is actually a really interesting element of this, that I find a lot of it comes down to networks. And in the same way as we build relationships, think about all your friends over the course of your whole life. You know that there's only going to be very few by the end of your life who have lasted the whole journey. But how do you find the high quality relationships in your life? And I think the answer to that question, I have found, often maps very similarly to how do you determine the quality of a feedback loop within a customer pool, in a business model? And that is, these threads, often it comes down to, are you playing the mastery game, like John mentioned, or are you playing another game within that mastery game? Because it's fine whichever one it is, but let's just get down to the brass tacks, as they say in Ireland, to actually understand where you're operating from. And the only other thing I'd add is, the term feedback loop has kind of been a little bit overused, I'd say, over the past couple of years. But when you get into businesses as a system, that becomes almost one of the most simplest ways of breaking down complexity to understand the quality of relationships in the feedback loop. And certainly for me, one of the biggest insights for a Costco and retail generally, or even, working with Stripe and different businesses that effectively only talk in feedback loops, only talk in ecosystems, it's a very different way of defining it. But effectively, if you can find the right feedback loop in your business model that matters, then you can actually almost exclusively focus on the quality of those over 10 years. And that's what masters do. They don't try and be perfect in every element, every pattern of the production of their unit. They actually just find what matters and then focus only on those elements. And they can actually, which is freeing, because you can actually then discard a lot of the other wastage that I think in a world where, you're being compared to your competitors every single day, you get pulled in the wrong direction there. Whereas the mastery route is actually, and this is folks who know Berkshire and Munger's way of looking at the world is quite similar to how he would define it. But effectively, choose your own game and be the master in that game, and then over time, people will see a moat, but you may not see it because it was just your journey, right? And it's no different, but it's just in a slightly different context.
I would add to that as well. If the question is, or if our goal here is to immerse ourselves in quality and partner with quality and invest in quality and so on, one of the things we did was look at, how much quality is a proportion of the whole ought we expect in the world. Some folks know this, but some may not. So for example, take everything we've just said. I think a logical conclusion from that is quality works on much longer time scales than months and quarters and sometimes even years. And yet, we went digging about for stats on the average duration of invested capital. And, it's hard to get exact numbers, but effectively, something on the order of 97 to 99.5% of all invested capital is invested with a time horizon of single digit years or less. And so when you really think about that and you think about what that drives, right, that tells you that, call it 98% or something of shareholders are encouraging enterprises to operate in ways that are rewarding on the order of, quarters or maybe single digit years or less, which means, how are we going to expect to find businesses that, actually, evolve positively in ways that, up their duration, not just by years, but by decades or maybe centuries. Point is it's very, very, very rare. And so we ought to expect the search to be difficult. The flip side of that is we ought to expect rewards in the search. I think we all have. I mean, we had a jam session a few months ago where we just talked about products that we've had in our lives for years, and we all have a story of a tie or a guitar or a watch or something that actually is better today than the day we bought it 10, 20, 30 years ago. And there's real deep rewards in that. And that's part of what's, I think, motivating here is not just in kind of the investment sense of, buying something that might last a long time, but also just the rewards that accrue to that kind of ownership, which are very, very different from the rewards that accrue to ownership, where you're expecting rewards on the order of days, weeks, quarters, years.
Two big things sparked in me with this conversation or this thread here. One is it makes me think a little bit of like the Nadals or Kobe Bryants of the world, where it's just like, it's all about the process. It's like they're up at 4 a.m. and it's like, it's not because anyone's there. It's not for any other reason that they love it. Right. And they have this vision at the end of it. And I think, again, different field of mastery, but really similar. Right. And which CEOs, which company builders are the Kobe's of their field, right? They're doing the hard work in the early days, when no one's up, when it's still dark outside, and they just love it, right? They love the process. And I think that's probably something that's not, quantitatively like capturable or anything like that. And it's probably like a relatively hard thing to get at. And Will, maybe you can touch on that with everything you're doing at IP, but that's one spark. The other thing that came to mind is Munger in Port Charlie's Almanac, like reverse engineers a $2 trillion business, right? Like, forget the exact name he uses, but like the sugar, Coke essentially.
Yeah.
And it might be a fun thought exercise of like reverse engineering like a quality company, right? Like from the ground up, and using that as like the baseline, right? And if no companies meet that, one, like super interesting, and two, like why not? And three, maybe go build that company, right? And I know you're all sort of in various processes of doing something like that. But if you haven't kind of reverse engineered the perfect quality company, maybe it's a fun journey to go on. Will, so maybe I interrupted you before, but if not, maybe take the lead here.
I mean, it's a deeply humbling experience. I think part of what, in parallel to the conversations we've been having, I've been through. Well, I would say a psychological crisis is a bit dramatic, but just noticing in how many ways my behavior in on a personal level or within our business does not reflect or embody quality. That it's been humbling in the sense of realizing how lost I can be in a map, in a theory, in an idea, in a concept. And that's also, it's very normal in the context of our culture that is very theory heavy, map heavy. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist heavy. And so I think, I mean, and I feel Paul, and it's such a joy to spend time with Paul and John because they are just so much more systematic than I am. And so I learn a lot from I'm sure most of it's going over my head, but at least in the context of what you've invited around reverse engineering a quality organization or quality business, that there's some patterns that I would throw out to the group. We've spoken about coherence with the system, resonance, reciprocity with all relevant stakeholders. By definition, the more coherent you are with the stakeholders in the system, the longer you are likely to last, the more chance you have of attaining mastery. That there's playing infinite games, seeing wins and losses as moments in continuing play. So I think about this in our context. What could we, in the context of our business, what is it that invites an infinite game? What could we be doing that then connects to, I think, this idea of, and for lack of a better way to phrase it, and I think probably Paul and John could phrase it more effectively, I would term it business as ministry. It's this surrender into service, that there's, and I mean, I guess there's all these sort of pithy statements around sort of the meaning of life is to find something more important to yourself and devote yourself to it. And if we then combine that with systems coherence, well, the deepest service would be service that is coherent with the whole. In other words, that contributes to the flourishing of the whole. And so there's maybe a fractal dimension of that, of finding an element, one relationship that one might want to work on, building that feedback loop, surviving and then expanding over time, or ensuring that whatever you're doing on one level is coherent with the rest of the system. So there's this sense of business administry to be business as ministry. I see that as a practice of becoming the fullest expression of oneself in service of the whole. So it's not a sort of a mere surrender to the needs of the wider system. I don't think that's interesting from an evolutionary perspective. I think the real interest from an evolutionary perspective is a becoming of one's fullest individual potential in coherence with the wider system. And so, for lack of a better word, I guess it's the idea of sort of ministry of service, and of whatever we're building being a reflection of, because if it's not deeply interesting on an individual level, and I see this in practice, we've been through just a real struggle, and my co-founder is so patient with me, because I'm caught off in all sorts of abstract ideas and grand visions and plans, and my, I'll waver in my level of engagement. And I think it's been this incredibly humbling experience of learning to really get down to what is it he and I actually love out of this work, that is the bridgehead, that is the fulcrum that sort of pulls us into our own individuation. And then there's an attunement to the wider system. And if we're really going to build something very interesting, sustainable, that is quality, then it's got to have that system's coherence. And I think we've talked quite a bit about territories and maps and the danger of getting lost in maps. So anything that, if you were going to engineer failure, it would be something that gets lost in a map. It would be a business that's run from a spreadsheet. It would be a business that's disembedded from the underlying relationships that constitute the actual quality. It's not the things themselves, and that a spreadsheet or a map is static, that it captures components. The quality, the conclusion I think we come to is the quality is in the relationships. And those relationships are brought to life through attention and paying attention. And there that takes on down the rabbit hole of, well, how do I learn to better pay attention? And I've learned that I'm actually really crap at it a lot of the time. So again, very, very humbling. But yeah, I guess the recap, and maybe we can pull in any of these threads, but infinite game, a coherence with the system, is this notion of business as ministry, being embedded in the territory. And maybe a last one to throw out is the concept of fractals in the context of quality. And maybe I can maybe John or Paul.
Can I riff on that a bit, because I think it's a beautiful connection from let's call it practical, measurable business output. I know you're speaking more broadly than that, but from that back to the things that matter deeply that can't be measured. So I would deeply agree with the business as ministry model, or it was taught to me as the model of servant leadership. But there's sort of a basic first principles argument here that I think, I think is just wildly underappreciated, right? So if you exist to make a product or service to make yourself money, then de facto you're going to make that product or service only as good as it needs to be sold. And there's an inherent problem there, right? There's a longevity problem there, because that immediately invites someone else to come in and do it better if they just care a bit more than you and they work a bit more than you. And so there's a longevity problem there, but there's also a relationship problem there. Because let's say you make tables, right? If you make an okay table and sell it, your customer will figure out that they've not gotten your best from you. Eventually, the first one might not, but eventually folks figure these things out, right? And these things compound. And so what you miss is the building of relationship. And this, so back to your point on fractals, the scales, right? So if you make a wonderful table and sell it, that builds a certain amount of, there's a certain amount of honesty in putting forth your best in your work, that actually through transaction builds trust. And over time, more and more trust is built as you make and sell more and more tables. That's also a route towards mastery. And so you get this positive feedback loop of, I put my best in a thing, I build trust, I build relationships, I practice my craft, I get better and better. And so you have these positive flywheels that start to spin. And that from a fractal perspective, right? So that scales starting at the level of the craftsman, up to the level of the business, up to the level of, call it, society, and then eventually all the way up, possibly globally. And really what's embedded in there that I think is important is there's the sort of unit sales and unit profit and whatever would show up in a spreadsheet, which are important from a business perspective. But there's also the honesty in work and trust that accrues to that work that compounds over time. And those are the things that never show up in spreadsheets. And so back to whether it's Paul's example of the tea caddy business or whatever else, it's just, and some of this maybe is lacking language as well, but we've looked at what lasts. It's not just wonderful products or services. Those are important, but there's much, much, much more to it. And that gets back to what was being said of relationships and a certain posture towards your community that's not just profit and product and whatever. It's some of those things, but it's other things as well. So anyway, Will, I just thought you expressed that beautifully. That's the off spreadsheet stuff that's so critical here.
And the only thing I'd add is what we're all describing is there's huge white space in trying to analyze this through a logical lens and a rational lens and financial lens that is yet to be defined. And so I think Michael Mubason's research is really interesting on this, where he just focuses on the customer relationships, the value of intangibles, to create a language, as what Damodoran is doing the same thing, where he's creating language for the financial community to actually understand what created Seas Kennedy, what created all the value apart from the 40 million of tangible assets that was on the balance sheet, because it's delivered 2 billion in cash flows. So it's like, you've obviously the wrong map. So can we talk about what was missing? And same with Geico. When you actually look back, it's there are some people who are really redefining the language being used, and then there's lots of folks who just are ignoring all of that and assuming it's not important. And what we find when we go back to kind of Fritjof Capra, who's very interesting on a kind of where blind spots are generally across disciplines, this is something that comes up over and over, where folks, by defining their problem in physics, they'll completely discount every other solution to be able to find quality within the same realm. And actually, maybe the answer is removing your finance hat and saying, HR, going to them and saying, what's the culture of this business over the next 10 years? Because over 10 years, that's the most important thing, but over 1 year, it's not important. And like that's a very different way of measuring this item of quality that I think it just constantly comes up. And that ties back to Nadal as well, Blas, that your comment is, it becomes all about process. And I've always noticed that with like leadership books, and Josh Waitzkin talks about this, Carol Dweck talks about it as growth mindset. I think there's something quite perennial we're seeing, even in architecture. Over 10 years, maintenance is almost all that matters. But over 1 year, the build of a home and the foundations, the quality of the build generally is all that matters. And so there's like this unusual thing that you have to first define the time frame over which you're defining the variables, and then you can go to say, what map helps me understand that feedback loop. And there's certain Japanese shrines that have been up for 2,000 years, and every 20 years they're completely broken down and then rebuilt from scratch. And then there's others that are just, they've been nothing but well maintained with the same quality of wood that was a certain type of wood that would last over that whole period of time. And so there's, what I'm trying to say is, process over outcome is important, but there's also an element that you have to be a survivor for process to matter. And so it's linking those two paradoxes. We have found a lot of fruitful information comes out, and there are many circumstances in our lives where we're playing a game. The survivorship, the survival rate is very low, but we still win. So that's why I use the term relationships and family, friends, relationships, and your partners. You've chosen. So what is it? What are the threads that you use to choose that person over the next? Because I think intuitively you probably know a lot more than you give yourself credit to define the quality of a relationship, or the quality of an individual, and your likelihood of surviving in your relationship or in your network or whatever that might be. Maybe a little bit abstract, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of context.
Can I try to tie that back to organizations?
Sure.
So this is where I think an appreciation for how organizations have evolved is really, really important. So, until really a few hundred years ago, we basically did not have large organizations. Militaries and governments were the first examples we had in human history of, let's say, large scale human coordination. And for centuries, militaries were really the only large scale coordinated organization of human activity. And so the development of organizations that can have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of individuals working, say, in a business really that's only happened in the last 100 and a bit years. And in this context, I think that's vitally important. And here's why. So Paul has, and Paul, you may want to give us some color here, but Paul's told us the story of one of his relatives who owns a clothing shop in Scotland. Is that you, Paul? Yeah.
No, in Trim here in Ireland.
In Ireland, yeah. Sorry. And long story short, the owner is also the salesperson, and they sell a product and they have to stand behind the product. And if there's a problem, somebody comes back in and they hear about it, and so on. There's no sort of faceless support ticket / send an email or intercom quality chat. The transaction and the feedback on that transaction is all self-contained in one person. And for most of human history, certainly in the sense of commerce, that's been the case. And it's only in the last century that we've really broken that apart. And not only have we broken it apart, we have radically, wildly blown it apart. Where, I bet if you just look around at the objects around you, it'd be almost impossible for you to figure out who actually built the thing, or get any feedback back to the product designer, et cetera. And I think that comes at great cost. And without getting overly philosophical on that, if we reverse that and say, okay, well, what might we think of that in terms of quality? Organizations that have figured out quality seem to have ways to stay very close to their customers. It doesn't mean it's a one-to-one, you make the product and then you sell it. But it does mean, for example, some organizations tend to be wildly decentralized, even if they're very large, but with a very intentional philosophy of, we want decisions on our products and services to sit as close to the customer as possible, even if we have 100,000 people. Or just broadly organizations that take feedback very, very seriously, or organizations who just start with de facto. It wasn't that long ago that Costco and Amazon's return policies were kind of radical in the retail world, and their policies were basically, we'll take anything back, we're not going to ask questions. And so those, if we think about, success leaves clues. What are clues on quality as it relates to organization behind product? Tightness of feedback loop between product sale and product transaction and product, let's say, design or business design, seem to be a very, very important clue as it relates to duration of business and positive evolution of business.
Yeah, John, just to pull on that thread, like there's two. So Steve Jobs, this concept struck him in, I think it was the 80s or 90s, when he reached out to this guy called Joe Duran, and he noticed that the Japanese never used the term quality in any of their advertising. All the American companies used it. He was like, what is going on here? Because the Japanese have the better products than all of us, and they don't use the term at all. And there's two quotes that I'll just share. There's from Steve Jobs himself: if your products don't live up to it, customers will not keep that opinion for long in their minds. And so it comes back to what John just said. The duration of the customer relationship will be determined by what is perceived in the experience of the customer with the product ultimately. So whether you want to call it attrition, whether you want to call it customer loyalty or trust or coherence, it doesn't matter, but effectively it comes down to that. The second quote is actually coming back to how organizations design themselves around what feedback loop matters. And the quote is, what we're seeing, this is from Steve Jobs himself, what we're seeing is the quality leaders of today have integrated that quality technology well beyond their manufacturing into their sales and marketing, and out as far as they can touch the customer, and trying to create super efficient processes back to the customer all the way through to the delivery of the end product, so that they can have the most innovative products, understand the customer needs fastest. And so what's interesting is when you look at how he built his business, he basically anchored all the resources around the customer feedback loop and actually outsourced a huge amount of everything that didn't fit in that category. So all the finance, even today, they're famous for having one of the leanest finance team managing one of the biggest balance sheets in the world. But even on the tech end, they outsourced to a lot of consulting businesses, anything that was procurement related, supplier related, maybe there were certain elements they would feed in. And so it's a really interesting concept to break out a business and start saying, how did it evolve itself? What was the direction of evolution? Was it a high quality evolutionary pattern, or is it low quality? And in my life anyway, how I was able to even unpack that, it's, well, how do I define a quality individual or community over time? And how do I spot the patterns of one evolving in a positive direction or a negative direction? And they tend to be the same muscle memory that you use. And you have language in it in certain parts of your life, but you might not in the commercial end.
So this sparks so much in me. One thing here, directly on this point is like, I've been thinking a lot about like pricing and like business model innovation and like how that is very interesting to sort of dig into. Google famously with like Dutch auctions, right? It wasn't like that was like as big of an innovation as PageRank, right? And I think that's really, really interesting to think about. And I guess like one hook into this might be like, can you turn a one-off transaction that sort of does lead naturally to like 1 year thinking and sort of just like take my product and run into an ongoing relationship, right? And I think that's where maybe like SaaS is super interesting, right? Like if Superhuman stops delivering for me, like I'm out, no problem. And like, you have to prove that value time and again. So I think there's something like really interesting about that. And whether it is a subscription or maintenance costs or whatever, right? How do you turn a one-off transaction into ongoing relations? Related to that, seeing what Uber, Airbnb, et cetera, does with ratings, reputation, quality, I think is also super interesting. And like, imagine you could judge like every interaction with a company like you could your Uber driver or whatever, right? Like Apple's customer service would probably get like a 1 star from me. They're like notoriously bad, at least in like my experience with them, right? Like I buy these crazy expensive headphones, it stops working and it starts peeling. Like, sorry, not on Apple Care. Like, buy another pair or get a Genius appointment 6 months out from now. It's like, okay, I guess I'll live with this for now. So that like rating of like various aspects of a business might be interesting to think about. So that's kind of one. Going back 1 or 2 steps, like I think there's something interesting, John. I think you kind of described this hierarchy of like from individual to company to societal, and it just makes me think like so many of these things starts with the individual, right? It's overly ambitious and difficult to say like I'm just going to turn this company into a quality company. Like I think that's nearly impossible, right? If not, like good luck. Like I don't want to try to take that on. But I think you can start with like yourself, right? And that's where I think this is like maybe getting to like the applicable part of it to like day-to-day lives is like one, figuring out what that means for you, right? Like what are your priorities? How does that shape your day and how you spend your time and who you surround yourself with, et cetera, et cetera. And then that ladders up into if you're building a company, your company, or if you're part of a company, how you interact with people. And I think that thread is like really interesting, getting back to process, right? It's like, it's not that anybody will see the inside of an iPhone. It's like Steve Jobs couldn't help it. And like, you want those people in your life and in your company, right? Like, it doesn't matter if nobody ever sees it. Like nobody cares. And I don't want to talk about getting up like at first thing in the morning to run like 2-mile sprints, right? Like that's not the thing. So I think like quality from individual is like an interesting thread. Sorry to keep rambling. Here's
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. One thing, and this is I guess like very top of mind for me these days too. Kind of this idea that just like goals are reached orthogonally or almost like paradoxically, right? Like Brunello Cucinelli comes to mind in a big way, right? Like one of the most profitable like luxury retailers. They're done at 5:30 every day. He swims for 2 hours and plays tennis and blah, blah, blah. Like the best companies, let's say, like I don't think set out to be the best company. They have some vision, they have some like obsession that they can't help and they get there, but it's not become profitable. Like that's not the goal almost ever, or ever, I would say. Will, this is now like 3 steps back now, but one thing that you said that I hadn't really ever pieced together before. So the win-win framework, if you think of each of those as relationships, right, which they are, it's not just like an Excel spreadsheet on the other side. And I think you framed it as like quality as relationships, which I hadn't really thought of it that way. And one thing, not that you have to measure it in some way, but what came to mind is kind of this idea of like a quality graph or a quality network, right? Like you can build a social graph, you can build a social network, you can have an interest graph, an interest network. What if there was some sort of semblance of like a quality network, right? Whether it was number of interactions or, again, getting back to win-win or something like that. But there's something that kind of struck me around that idea that you can maybe judge the quality of these relationships in such a way that you have a better understanding of, you know, let's put temporary numbers on it for a second, but you know, maybe it is NPS, maybe that's the simplest way, but like, you know, the supplier relationship has NPS of 6, and the employee has an NPS of 10. Cool. Okay. Like employee stuff is good right now. Suppliers need to be like thought about a little bit more. So those are like 4 very discoherent, uncoherent thoughts to what was said, but just like I thought they were each worth touching on for a second. And yeah, John, go for it.
Oh boy.
You lost your train of thought. Yeah.
Let's see if I can get it back.
Quality begins as an individual, I think was
yes,
the
there
thread.
you go. Yes, yeah. Well, that's another, you know, on this success leaves clues. I mean, that's another, you know, well, just yeah. So an obvious pattern, I guess, that's come out of this is when one encounters something that is of high quality, often there's a story of someone's obsession behind it. There's absolute obsession. And I think obsession is a good word, partly because it's sort of connotes somebody elevating something besides profit in why they do the thing. I mean, I think of, you know, wonderful chefs, or everybody knows Steve Jobs' story, but you know, there's a lot of cases where what became exceptional started as just a pursuit of mastery of something that just went and went and went and went and went, and then it's almost like a business got wrapped around that.
And to jump in really quickly, it's like it's also a magnet, right, for other people who resonate with that, right? Like nobody's forcing you to be surrounded by this psychotic, likely person who has, you know, unbearable standards, who are hard to work with. But like, you know, Disney was that back in the day before Jobs, right? Like he would be like irrationally high bar. And like I'm personally drawn to that. Like I love that, and that's hard, and it's not normal, and it's scary, and all that stuff. But like, I think, you know, to me, it's like a ripple effect, or like an unintended consequence of like you just bring people into your orbit who resonate with that, right? And it doesn't make for maybe smooth sailing or like, you know, perfect lifestyle in a lot of cases, or whatever it might be. But if you elevate something meaningful rather than like happiness or something like that, or, you know, elevate quality, then that makes a lot more sense than just like, this guy is crazy and why would anybody care this much about this widget?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's we don't have to chase this tangent, but I think just at the level of society, so back on the point of a lot of this starts at the individual level. At the level of society, I think we just do a horrible disservice to young folks coming out of high school and college, and then generally to society as a whole, because it doesn't seem like we start with the question of where will those folks do their best work. It seems that we start with a whole bunch of other things, and I mean, I remember looking in college for you know, data that would kind of help me connect things that I knew I was interested in, that I knew I had some skill in, with jobs, and it's almost non-existent. And certainly career services was useless. And then, you know, people say the obvious stuff like I want to be a VC or whatever, but I think the fundamental question ought to be, and our learning from all of this ought to be, that where will you do your best work? I mean, certainly a learning from all this is if you see a person skilled in their work, they'll do very, very well. But it's very hard to be skilled in your work, and it's certainly not enough to be motivated by profit. And so you've got to kind of dig down into this, you know, what work can you love? What work can get you out of bed at 4 a.m? What work can you obsess about? And just wonderful things come from that, including businesses and service to society and development of other people and all that. But you've really got to start with where will you do your best work?
Beautifully put. Team, we are towards the end of our time here, and not to get to some interesting point and then having to cut off last minute. Any other like big juicy topics or points you want to get across? You know, I think one goal I think was to just talk about this idea, this project, like the reasons behind it, use it as sort of this black hole, this magnet for others who are interested in this, and bring them into the orbit. Anything else we should kind of dive into with the time we have remaining?
Just one thing that I'd add, and it touches on a really interesting point that you brought up, both Will and Blas. Quality as relationships is a really interesting one, because certainly what I've learned through a lot of this is trust is an emergent pattern from behavior, which is really counterintuitive, because I actually never really had thought about that. But what it led me to try and break down in customer pools, for example, you notice Mubausen has this analysis. In the first 3 years, that's when people churn. So people make a decision really quickly to drop something if they don't like it. And it's the same in relationships. If you think about dating, it's the same, right? And so if we just invert that and say, what have you actually, what do you trust that's been in your life for more than 4 years? I think you get to something really interesting, because you dump 99% of the outcomes that basically were just frictional kind of noise within the signal, and you start to focus on the patterns that actually matter to you. And I think if you start to look at mentors and people around you and start to say, who do I trust? And then what led to that over time, and start extending the time horizons of the questioning, you start to see what you formed meaning in, which is how you define a quality you like, which is the final piece I'll leave you with. We all have our own map. I have a different definition to Will, to John, to Ferdy, all of us. And so it's what qualities are you searching for around you on a daily basis and on a minute by minute basis. And I think the interesting thing is we're already living them. It's just whether you open your eyes to how you're living them. And so, not to get too metaphysical about it, but it is a paradox within itself. And I think that's the source of where this becomes an interesting wide space, that you can start to unpack these things a little bit better and find that your own personal language with it.
I would add 2 things. So one, just a general point, we do have an intention to publish something, and I'll leave the something as general for now. I'd say we've probably done more work on what we're not going to publish than what we are. We have a draft of a sort of wildly interconnected quality map through some cool software called Obsidian, and so I won't make any promises on what, but there is intention to take these learnings and sort of deeply connect them, and then make them available for those that are interested. The other thing I would say is Jeannie and Randy, if you have any questions or want to connect either now or offline, we're certainly open to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
I think John had just a fantastic point about in regard to education and other things, it's finding out what people are good at, and of course operating a business too, but that's critically important and so overlooked.
Yeah, I have a huge resonance with that. Case in point, my daughter just texted last night at midnight saying she's in her first year of college and is feeling major struggle and loss of like, what do I do with my life? What's my purpose? And I think if there's some way to connect people with get them into a really positive relationship with themselves first and foremost, but then also help them learn how to develop relationships that are going to be attuned and in line with what they're really curious about and interested in. I think there's so much possible using that as a foundation.
So I have one idea that one thing I love about being a part of this is it makes you think more about quality. And I was reading Invent and Wander, Jeff Bezos, and he talks about controversy equals innovation, or I'm summarizing it, but controversy equals innovation. So does controversy equal quality in an organization? In other words, do you need that? And I'm grabbing from everybody what everyone said here. Paul talked about willingness to fail. So if you don't innovate, if you're not willing to fail, you won't innovate. Will talked about tension. So tension is basically controversy, right? You're not going to resonate if you don't innovate. So it just for me, that kind of worked as a core when you feed out to everything that John said about decentralization, obsession, Bloss about reverse engineering, all that stuff goes into innovation, which all comes from controversy, I think.
I think that's really a very rewarding line of questioning, that you could speak about quality as a move from a zero sum to a positive sum relationship with tension or controversy or difficulty, or another, you could talk about it as resistance. And you just, Paul had a beautiful example around the Japanese master and their ability to talk about difficulty effectively, right? That there's a meeting of the tension, the resistance. There's another saying that I heard someone say that was fantastic in this context recently, was people that can't grieve together can't make good decisions together.
They can't what together?
People that cannot grieve together
Agree.
cannot make good decisions together. That if you cannot encounter difficulty in a positive sum sense, it's very hard to last a long time. It's very hard to grow. It's, if not impossible, to grow and develop. You end up in stasis. And so this element of resistance, I think, is incredibly fruitful. And that then, I think, invites just, it's becomes quite clear that we look at great businesses, effective systems, they move or have an ability to move towards difficulty, which is, I think, in our general cultural context, actually quite difficult. Is that there actually are real rewards to behaving in this way, because we have a cultural blind spot around vulnerability. I think, but there's probably much more to be said about that. But I think it's awesome. It's so interesting, and this how one relates to tension, how one navigates tension, and moving from zero sum to positive sum is maybe a big part of it.
Yeah, Randy,
there's-
like one other piece that I come back to when you ask that question is, at what layer are you trying to innovate? And I think what we see over and over is, even, Mark Leonard in Constellation, he is seeking to innovate at the customer level. So he's saying, what innovation do you want me to make for you, customer A? And then let us co-build that over the next 5 years. And I think it's a pattern that we keep seeing even in retail business. Costco is a great example. They're innovating at the level within each of their store prints, but and within the footprint of their store, apologies. But I don't know how much innovation is happening at a business model level. They've done a lot of that, I think. So now it's at a store level that they're allowing for this culture of innovation to happen. And you see this with Jeffrey West's work on cities. The cities that don't cultivate a startup ecosystem or innovation generally become static and die, which is really unusual, because cities actually are quite enduring within themselves. But this layer of innovation is something that's required for our social systems to share ideas, and for people to actually have more and more energy over time, not too dissimilar to Bloss and Lattice work, right? That we're sharing ideas that energize us, that then we can go and leverage off. And there's something really deep in that idea of innovation at a customer level that a lot of these businesses have figured out. Stripe want to be the infrastructure, very slow and non-innovative, but infrastructure layer like the railroad. But on the customer level, they'll be the most rapid innovators in the world. Same with Berkshire. There's certain elements of their business model that they seek to be very slow and enduring in their balance sheet, but then on the front end, they say compete as hard as you need to build your moat. Like, their tension points and paradoxes that many other people wouldn't see. But that's actually a pattern that keeps coming up. Amazon's a great example, right? Where you have the same dynamic. And that's why a lot of these Pool Corp and, there's lots of businesses are really boring and really annoying, but they've lasted 200 years. Why? Because they innovate at the right place. And then in the back end, they're stable. And that's quite similar to, social system and kind of cities that we all live in, where the governing bodies change very slowly. However, innovation might happen really quickly. And so it comes back to pace layering, which is a concept by Stuart Brown worth checking out. I know, Randy, you've seen me bore you enough with this kind of stuff, but anyway, that's my couple of thoughts on it.
Randy couldn't help but throwing a bomb as time was running out. Just classic Randy. Awesome question. Thank you. Team, this was super interesting. I think we hit on a lot of really interesting points. Would love to make this, a recurring every couple weeks, couple months, whatever the right time frame here is, to just kind of keep digging into it and sort of, I can see this building over time, and to be cool from like in 5-10 years, just kind of see how the thinking evolves, right? Like you'll share something that's polished and beautiful and incredibly helpful, but like going back to process, like seeing how this changes and like all the dead ends and all the rabbit holes that aren't worth going down and where we eventually end up. So let's find a time again soon. But thank you again for putting in all the time to think through this and taking the time to share with us today. This is really fun.
Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
So much
Well
fun.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good
Pleasure.
one.
All
Take
right.
care.
Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Blas.
See you soon.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye.